I knew something had shifted the moment his mother set the table and didn't put a fork at my place. Not dramatically, not obviously, she just moved around the dining room with that particular kind of efficiency that older women develop after decades in the same kitchen, setting each spot with a careful deliberateness. One fork, one knife, one folded napkin, and she passed right over me like I was a guest who hadn't confirmed. I didn't say anything. I reached over quietly and took a fork from the extra setting at the end of the table, the one she kept for her youngest son when he visited. My boyfriend, Elliot, was in the kitchen helping his father open a bottle of wine and didn't see any of it. That was in October, 7 months into the relationship and the first time I'd ever met his family. Let me back up. I had been working at Mercy General for 4 years by then. The hours were long and the cases were difficult, and I had gotten used to a kind of invisible life outside the hospital. Grocery runs at 11 p.m., sleeping through Sunday mornings, missing birthday dinners because a 12-year-old had come in with a closed head injury, and you just didn't leave. I was used to people not knowing what I did. I preferred it, actually. When you tell someone you're a neurosurgeon at a dinner party, the conversation stops being a conversation. It becomes an interview or a confession. People start asking you about their aunt's MRI results, or whether their migraines are serious, or whether you've ever lost someone on the table. I got tired of it the way you get tired of a song that used to mean something. So when I met Elliot at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in March, neither of us mentioned work for the first 40 minutes. We talked about the bread vendor who was out of sourdough again and whether the heirloom tomatoes were worth $8 a pound, and I laughed more than I had in months. When he finally asked what I did, I said I worked at the hospital. He nodded and said he was in commercial real estate and we moved on to other things. He never pushed for specifics. I never offered them. By the time it mattered, it felt like something I'd forgotten to mention rather than something I'd hidden. I worked at the hospital. That was true. I just didn't elaborate on what that meant. His family lived about 90 minutes north of the city, outside a small town in upstate New York, the kind of place where everyone went to the same high school and the same church and still remembered what your parents did for a living. His father had been a contractor for 30 years. His mother volunteered at the school library twice a week and made her own jam. They were not unkind people. I want to be clear about that. They were the kind of people who believed certain things about the world without examining them too carefully, and in that way they were not so different from most people I had ever met. The drive up was easy. Elliot held my hand on the highway and sang along to the radio and told me stories about growing up there. The summer he and his brother flooded the basement, trying to build a fish tank. The Thanksgiving their grandmother fell asleep at the table before the turkey came out. The way his mother always burned the rolls and then blamed the oven like it was a long-standing disagreement between them. He made his family sound warm. He made me feel like I was being welcomed into something. We pulled into the driveway at 4 in the afternoon. White farmhouse, black shutters, a pickup truck in the driveway with a bumper sticker from a contractor's supply company. His father was on the porch before we even got out of the car. Tall, broad, the kind of man who shook hands like he was testing something. His mother appeared behind him and came down the steps quickly, the way women do when they've been watching from the window. She hugged Elliot first, long and tight, and then turned to me with a smile that was genuine enough, warm in the way of someone who had decided in advance to be pleasant. "We're so glad you made it," she said. I handed her the flowers I brought, dahlias from the market, pale orange and cream, and she smiled and said they were lovely and set them on the porch railing without putting them in water. That was the second thing I noticed. Inside, the house smelled like pot roast and something sweet, apples maybe. Family photos lined the hallway, school portraits, a wedding photo, a framed snapshot of Elliot and his brother at a lake somewhere, maybe 12 years old, both squinting into the sun. His father poured glasses of sweet tea without asking if we wanted any. We sat in the living room on furniture that had probably been there since Elliot was in middle school, and the conversation moved the way it does when people are feeling each other out. His brother Wes arrived about 20 minutes later with his wife, Jen. Jen was from the same town, had gone to the same high school, had a 2-year-old named after Elliot's paternal grandfather. She walked in like she'd been walking into this house her whole life, because she had. She kissed his mother on the cheek and picked up a conversation mid-sentence from the last time they'd seen each other. I watched all of this from the couch and smiled when smiled at, and tried to find the edges of where I fit. "So you work at the hospital?" his father asked at one point. He said it the way people say things they already think they know the answer to. "I do," I said. "Nursing?" I paused just slightly. "No, I'm in surgery." "Oh, scheduling? Administration?" "I'm actually in the operating room," I said. "Neurosurgery." He nodded in the way that men of a certain generation nod when they've stopped listening. "Good for you," he said. "Good steady work." Elliot's brother changed the subject to football. I let it go. At dinner, the fork incident happened. I said nothing about it. His mother had made the pot roast and Jen had brought a salad, and there was a basket of rolls that were, in fact, slightly burned on the bottom, and the conversation turned to Wes and Jen's plans to expand the house. They were putting in a second bathroom, and his father had opinions about the contractor they'd hired, and they went back and forth about load-bearing walls while I cut my meat and listened. "Elliot mentioned you're renting downtown," his mother said to me at some point. She had a way of phrasing things that made them sound like gentle concerns. "I am, yeah. I like being close to the hospital." "It must be expensive," she said. "Those apartments." "It's manageable," I said. She nodded slowly. "Of course. Although once you're settled, once things are more stable." She didn't finish the sentence, but the shape of it was clear enough. "Once you're settled, once you have a real situation, once you're not just a hospital employee renting a city apartment on a hospital employee's salary." "How long have you been there?" Wes asked. He was friendlier than his father, more curious. But the question had the same assumption underneath it. "About 4 years," I said, "since I finished my residency." A small pause. "Residency for what?" "Neurosurgery," I said again. Wes looked at me more carefully this time. "Like, you do surgeries?" "I do. On brains." "And spines, yes." He looked at Elliot. Elliot was watching me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Something between pride and sheepishness, like a man who'd just realized he'd been carrying something valuable in his pocket the whole trip without mentioning it. "You never said," Wes started. "We don't really talk about work," Elliot said. His father had gone very still across the table. "So, you're a brain surgeon," he said. Not a question exactly. More like he was trying out the weight of the words. "Neurosurgeon," I said. "Yes." Nobody spoke for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the county road. His mother reached over and picked up the serving spoon I'd been using and put it back in the bowl of green beans without looking at me. I'm not entirely sure what I felt in that moment. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated, the particular tiredness of watching people rearrange their faces because new information arrived. "How long does that take?" his father asked. "The training." 4 years of medical school, 7 years of residency, I said, and then a fellowship. He did the math slowly. His wife watched him do it. "So you've been doing this since you were what, 30? 31, I said. He looked down at his plate. He cut a piece of pot roast. He chewed. He was a man who processed things at his own speed, and I respected that even then. Dinner resumed, but it wasn't the same dinner. His mother started asking about my hours. Did I work nights? Did I have to be on call? Was it hard to maintain? She paused, searching for the right word. Balance. She meant with a family, with children, with the version of my life she'd assumed I was on the road to building. "It can be," I said honestly. "You learn to manage it." Jen, who had been quiet for most of the meal, looked over at me. She was not unkind, but there was something careful in her eyes, something like recalculation. I had walked into this house as one thing and was now apparently another, and she was figuring out what that meant for the seating arrangement of her world. His father cleared his throat. Elliot never mentioned this. I know, Elliot said. You don't talk about work, his father repeated. The words had a different quality now, not a neutral observation. A question. I set down my fork. I don't like leading with my job, I said. It tends to change things. His father looked at me directly for the first time all evening. What kind of things? The way people talk to me, I said. The things they ask about. The way they decide what I'm worth before they've finished saying hello. The table was quiet. His mother made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Well, she said, that sounds exhausting. It is, I said, and I meant it simply without edge. After dinner, his mother brought out coffee and a pie she'd made from scratch. Apple, the smell I'd noticed when we arrived. She served Elliot first, then Wes, then Jen, then me. Small mercies, noted. His father moved to the armchair across from the couch and folded his hands. He had the bearing of a man who was used to being the authority in a room and was presently unsure of his footing. So you went to medical school, he said. It was the beginning of a longer thought, I could tell. Columbia, I said. He nodded once. I didn't elaborate. Your parents must be proud. They are. My mother still tells the neighbors I'm a doctor, like I just got the news last week. Wes laughed. Genuinely, the room loosened just slightly. Where did you grow up? His mother asked. Indiana, I said. Small town, actually. Smaller than this one. She looked surprised. People usually did. Somewhere in their calculation was the assumption that someone who ended up doing what I did must have grown up somewhere with more resources, more momentum, more obvious runway. The idea that I came from a place not so different from this one, that was harder to fit into the existing frame. Was your father a doctor? He drove a delivery truck for 30 years, I said. My mother was a school secretary. Nobody spoke for a moment. Well, his father said slowly, and then seemed to decide not to finish that sentence either. Later, when Elliot and his brother were helping his mother in the kitchen, his father and I sat alone in the living room. The house made the sounds old houses make, wood settling, heat ticking through the vents, the distant clatter of dishes. He looked at me for a long moment, not unkindly, more like someone reading a map they hadn't expected to need. I owe you something, he said finally. I waited. I made some assumptions earlier about who you were. He paused. About what you did. I know, I said. That wasn't right. I looked at him carefully. He was not comfortable with this conversation. He was having it anyway. That meant something. Thank you for saying so, I said. He nodded, looking down at his hands. They were the hands of someone who had worked with them his whole life. Thick knuckles. A scar along the left index finger from what was probably a table saw. The thing is, he said slowly, I would have been the same way even if you'd walked in and told us. I would have been, I don't know. Impressed, maybe. Deferential. He said the word like it tasted strange, and that's not better, is it? I looked at him. No, I said. It's not. He exhaled. Jen is a good woman, smart. She runs her own bookkeeping business out of the house, takes care of the baby. And I don't think I've ever asked her what she was working on. He said it quietly, like something occurring to him in real time. Not once. I didn't say anything. He wasn't talking to me exactly, or not only to me. My wife's at that table 50 times with Jen at it, he said, and she never handed her anything without asking. And tonight she handed you a serving spoon because she'd already made up her mind what you were. He went quiet. What changed? I asked. Not pointedly. Genuinely. He thought about it. Same thing that always changes, he said. Found out I was wrong. In the car on the way home, Elliot was quiet for a long time. The highway lights moved over the windshield in slow pulses, orange and dark, orange and dark. You could have told me, he said finally. I looked at him. I know. I feel like an idiot. Don't, I said. You weren't treating me like someone less important. You were just treating me like a person. He glanced over. Is that actually enough? It's rarer than you think, I said. He looked back at the road. My dad really asked you about nursing. He did. And the fork thing, I saw that. I know you did. He was quiet for another mile. I'm sorry, for what specifically? He thought about it. For not saying something, he said, at the table. When my dad, I just kind of sat there. You did, I said, not cruelly, just honestly. He accepted it. That was the thing about Elliot. He didn't argue with the truth when it arrived. He just sat with it until it became part of what he knew. The next morning I woke up early, as I always did, and made coffee and sat at the window watching the neighborhood come to life. Elliot slept late on Sundays. I'd learned to love that about him, the way he carried rest like it was something he'd earned. I sat there for an hour thinking about the evening and trying to figure out what I actually felt. Not hurt. That wasn't quite it. Not angry. Something more like the feeling you get after a long surgery. That particular combination of exhaustion and clarity, where everything is very precise and you can see exactly what was there and what wasn't. I thought about Jen. I thought about his mother, who had made that pie from scratch and probably hadn't been asked what she was working on either. Not for years, maybe not ever. I thought about the way their world had arranged itself around certain assumptions, that worth looked a certain way, that success announced itself in certain ways, that women who worked at hospitals were doing something noble and useful and limited, and I thought about my own assumptions, which were different but not absent. The way I had walked into that house expecting to be underestimated and had not been surprised when I was, the way I had stayed quiet and waited and watched, like I was running an experiment on people who hadn't consented to being studied. That part unsettled me more than the serving spoon. A week later, his mother called me. Not Elliot. Me. She asked if I'd be willing to come to a church fundraiser the following Saturday. A silent auction, she explained, and they were looking for professionals to donate consultations or services. She'd mentioned my name to the committee, and I could hear the pride in her voice now, the particular shine of it. They were very interested. She'd be wonderful, she told me. People would love to hear what she does. She meant well. I knew she meant well. She wanted to brag about me in the way that she had not thought to brag about me before, and that impulse came from a real place, even if it was complicated. I told her I'd think about it. I called my mother that afternoon. She answered on the first ring, as she always did, and I told her about the dinner and she listened without interrupting, which meant she was either very interested or very worried. She handed you a serving spoon, she said when I finished. She did. A pause. Was the roast any good? I laughed, which I hadn't expected to do. It was, actually. Well, she said, people are people. She'd said that my whole life. Not as an excuse, more as a starting point. People are people, and the question is, what you do with that. I don't know how to be what they think I am now, I said. It feels worse somehow. The trying, the careful questions. Because now they know what to be impressed by, she said. Before, they just had to figure out who you were. Which is harder? Which is harder? She agreed. Elliot and I had a long conversation the following week. Not a fight, more like a negotiation, or maybe an inventory. We sat at the kitchen table with takeout going cold between us, and we talked about the things we'd both been not quite saying. He told me he'd been struggling with something since the dinner. Not with who I was, but with the version of himself he'd seen at that table. The way he'd laughed at his father's jokes and stayed silent when he should have said something. He described it as going home in my brain, meaning the part of him that was still 17 at that table, still trying to not make it weird, still sorting himself into the architecture of his family's expectations. I don't do that with you, he said. I don't know why I do it there. Because it's home, I said. You get smaller in the places that used to hold all of you. He looked at me like that was a harder thing to hear than he'd expected. Do you trust me? He asked. Yes, I said, and I meant it. Do you trust that I love you? Not the surgeon part. I thought about it honestly. I think so, I said. I think that's what I was trying to find out, before I told you. He nodded slowly. And now? Now I'm watching, I said. The same way your dad is watching himself. That seemed right to him. He reached across the table and took my hand, and we sat there for a while, not saying anything. The takeout cooling between us, the evening light going slowly sideways across the kitchen floor. The following month, he came with me to the hospital. Not to the OR, not any official capacity, just to pick me up after a long Saturday shift. He arrived when I was still in scrubs, still carrying the particular weight of a 7-hour surgery that had gone exactly the way it was supposed to go, and had still felt, as they always did, like something you'd held together by deciding not to let go. He was waiting in the lobby, and one of my residents spotted him and said casually, "Is that Dr. Hale's boyfriend?" And Elliot heard it and turned, and I watched his face do something quiet and private. In the car, he said, "Dr. DeBell. Hale, that's the name, yes. I know your name. I know you do." He was quiet for a block or two. It's different hearing it there. In that building, people they talk about you like like I'm someone who knows what she's doing. I said, "Yeah." He glanced over. You know what I thought when your resident said that? I thought, she's going to think I'm not enough. I looked at him for a long moment. Elliot. I know it's not. You drove 90 minutes round trip to pick me up after a 12-hour Saturday because I mentioned I was tired, I said. That's not nothing. He drove. It's not about enough, I said. It was never about that. What was it about then? I thought about the farmer's market in March. The $8 tomatoes. The bread vendor out of sourdough. The way he'd made me laugh before I'd remembered I was tired. It was about whether you were real, I said. Whether what we had was about me or about the idea of me. He nodded slowly. And now? Now I think you're real, I said. I think we're still figuring out whether we know how to do this. Together. That's the idea. He reached over and turned the radio on, low, something old and familiar from a station neither of us had programmed. We drove the rest of the way, with the window cracked and the October air coming in cold and clean, and I thought about all the things I'd been protecting for so long from so many people, and how it had kept me safe and had also kept me alone in ways I hadn't entirely admitted. There's a specific kind of courage in letting people see you. Not the version of you that's been curated for their comfort, not the title or the achievement or the cleaned-up story you tell at dinner parties, but the actual you, with your cold takeout and your Sunday mornings and the way you still call your mother from the kitchen floor when something's hard. I had spent years keeping the two things separate, who I was at the hospital and who I was everywhere else. I told myself it was practical. It was protective. And it was in some ways. But it was also a way of never fully existing in any room I walked into. Half present, half hidden, always waiting to see what people would do with the information before I gave it to them. What I saw at that dinner, the fork, the serving spoon, the careful recalibration after the word neurosurgeon changed the temperature, was not cruelty. I want to be clear about that. It was something more ordinary and, in some ways, more troubling. It was the default, the unexamined, The thing people do when they haven't been asked to do otherwise. And the thing about unexamined things is that they tend to stay that way until something forces a look. His father called me 2 weeks after the dinner. He didn't say much. He asked how I was doing, whether the drive back had been okay, whether I liked apple pie, or whether he should have checked. I told him it was the best pie I'd had in a long time. He said his wife would be glad to hear it. There was a pause. I told her what I told you, he said, about the serving spoon. How did she take it? A short silence. She cried, he said, not because she was embarrassed, because she genuinely hadn't noticed. I sat with that for a long moment. That might be the harder thing, I said. It is, he said. And the way he said it told me he knew that from somewhere personal. We talked for another few minutes, about nothing much. The weather, the apple harvest, whether Elliot had mentioned coming up again for the holidays. And at the end of it, he said something I didn't expect. Thank you for not making it easy, he said. To dismiss you. I don't know that I would have looked at myself if you'd just announced yourself at the door. I didn't know how to answer that. So I just said, I'll see you at Thanksgiving. And I meant it. The truest version of a person is the one that shows up when they're not trying, when they don't know they're being looked at, when they haven't been given a reason to perform their better selves. I learned that in the OR, the way the body tells you what's really happening when it has no reason to pretend. You can spend years learning to read the signs, but the signs were always there. What I found at that dinner table, underneath the slightly burned rolls and the misplaced serving spoon and the long recalibrating silences, was not a verdict. It was a starting place. A set of people learning in real time that they had made a habit of measuring without noticing they were measuring, and a man who, when the information arrived, chose to sit with the discomfort of it rather than explain it away. That's not a small thing. Most people don't. If a story sounds familiar, if you've ever walked into a room and felt yourself sized up before you'd finished your first sentence, or if you've ever held something back because you'd seen what happened when you didn't, then you know what I mean when I say that dignity isn't about the reveal. It's about what you do with what the reveal shows you. About whether you can look at the gap between who you hope someone was and who they turned out to be and still decide to stay. Still decide to try. Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's not. For me, that October, sitting in a car with the window down and the radio low, driving back toward the city and all the things that were still unresolved, the answer was yes. And it's still yes.